Good morning.
Morning.
Nice to see you guys. Thanks for flying in from a couple of coasts to be here. And Matt, glad you're still here at the conference.
Me too.
Great to see you, man.
Every morning I say that.
Yeah, Matt and I are trying to figure out how to get these chairs brought to our offices. These are super comfortable. Well, I wanted to, like I said, spend a minute talking with these guys about what they're seeing in the industry. They have a very broad purview. Matter of fact, Seth, why don't you give folks a little more of an overview of where Thoma Bravo sits in the industry? It's the largest software PE firm now, the largest position in security. Tell us a little about that story.
Yeah, thanks. And I first of all, thanks for having us. This is awesome, an awesome event. We, we're one of the largest private equity firms in the country and the largest focused on software specifically. That's all we do. We've been at it for over 20 years now. And Andrew and I lead our cyber and infrastructure software investing initiative. And cyber for us has been, really our best investment sector over time. And it's also a really sort of unique perspective and just sort of path for investing in our industry. So we were very early into it. We've invested really in every aspect of of security, really up and down the value chain. Companies of all sizes, companies providing technology, really at all different intersects within security. And identity for us has been just a huge theme and an early theme, and one that has been an area for us that has become very, very core to our security strategy through many investments, including SailPoint now, our second time, obviously.
Yes. Matter of fact, why don't we kind of start there? You all were looking across the broad purview of the security industry. What was it that drew you to identity, and particularly maybe SailPoint as well? We were one of your early identity investments. What was it you saw emerging in that space? You were in a lot of other parts of the security landscape. What else were you seeing emerge at that point?
Yeah, so this was about a decade ago.
About a decade ago.
That we sort of started this journey with you the first time, and at that point we had been pretty heavily invested in companies around perimeter security. We had been in the endpoint a little bit. We had invested in a authentication business, an encryption company, and as we started to do our work in and around the sector in general, it became very clear that identity was still really early. Something that was much more of a compliance sale at the time, but something that was moving into being much more critical from a security perspective, and underpinning many of the digital transformations going on in the world, which of course accelerated during the pandemic, and we continue to see today. And just through our work, we came to identify SailPoint as being a disruptor in an industry that had existed, but existed in a different form. And when we met Mark and Kevin at the time, we as a firm just got incredibly excited about partnering with these incredible innovators and leaders and the company to really help the business continue a very accelerated growth and innovation path. And our whole business is about partnering with great leaders and innovators, and then bringing to bear a lot of our resources to help companies grow, continue to innovate and become industry leaders. And of course, from our perspective, this has been just an unbelievable journey. Stage one of our investment ended in an IPO, a really successful public offering. And we were part of that for a little over a year, and then sort of took a step back and sort of watched the company from afar, which led to step two in some instances.
Yeah. Well, here's a big one. So I wasn't here for round one, but here we are, round two. What brought you back again, Andrew, for another bite of the apple?
Yeah, great question. So it's really rare in our industry to get to work with the same company twice. You typically buy a company and you sell the company, and that's cradle to grave, basically. So our industry and our jobs, it's predicated on taking risk. And so we have to take risks on management teams, industries, companies, market dynamics. And we really have to make a very well-informed, educated bet that when we buy a company, it's going to perform for the next 4 to 5 years. When you're able to take a ton of risk out of the equation, meaning you know the industry, you know the company, and you know the people running the business, and you can work well with them, it really makes you feel better about making such a big investment. And when we bought SailPoint in 2014, when we became a majority shareholder, we paid around $300 million for the company. This go around, the valuation increased to $7 billion in 22. And so it was the biggest.
I always have to do this when you say
$7 billion in 2022. And so it's the single largest bet, not in cybersecurity, but just in software that we've made as a fund. And so knowing the business dynamics, knowing how you and your team operate, knowing that you have a track record of execution, both on the financial front as well as on innovation. Obviously we're staring down the night of signing, and we're all a little pale in the face, about to cut a $7 billion check, but we felt a lot better knowing.
We felt better about accepting it.
Yeah, no, we know. But we were able to sleep well, knowing that our capital was in good hands. So that's one thing that's really unique. And look, second, what you guys have done has been nothing short of amazing. In terms of scaled cybersecurity companies in the world, I'm talking like cybersecurity companies that are 500 million of revenue or bigger. On any given day, you're either the fastest growing cybersecurity company or the second fastest scaled growing cybersecurity company in the world, which is super unique. And you're doing it while generating profits. And so the re-IPO story, and that's our ultimate plan here, is to get SailPoint back into the public markets. It's going to be really attractive for investors because of the way you run your business. And look, the overall financial profile of the company today, in addition to growth, I mean, when we bought the company for the first time, 50 million of revenue, I remember modeling out the top line. You could fit all your customers on a single 25-line spreadsheet, and you could say, okay, they're coming up for renewal here. This is how many licenses they've been expanding by.
Some of them are here still.
Yeah. It was, just a really easy business to understand because it was so small, and it was cute. It was cute. You're going to do a billion. You're going to cross $1 billion next year, which is going to be awesome when we're here in a year.
Did Matt give you a new forecast? That's fantastic.
Yeah, we'll be north of $1 billion next year. Hopefully, if you get invited back. And 2,000 customers is just really phenomenal. What's happened. And then the last thing is identity is way more important today than it was 10 years ago when we bought the company. It was just on the cusp of kind of like a tipping point of becoming incredibly important in cybersecurity. And today, I think you can unequivocally say it's one of the most important, if not the most important, sub-market in cyber.
Well, let's probe on that a little bit, because we all had, and a lot of you have lived through this evolution, right? There's been a kind of an over time, a pretty significant shift in some of the core business drivers. Seth, you said this a minute ago about compliance. Maybe both of you kind of take what do you see, because you guys are always looking for business drivers in an industry, which drives opportunity for a software firm, right? What do you think have been the fundamental shifts in business drivers that have caused identity to be such a higher priority, from talking to all the security professionals you guys talk to all the time?
I think the biggest thing just over time is that security in general, and especially identity, has become an enabler of business and digital transactions, and also underpinning these enormous digital transformations that every company and every industry in the world now needs to go through to modernize. And when we started in security and in identity, I mean, it was something that you needed to do. Some companies were focused on it, some companies weren't. Nobody really had a CISO at the time. And of course, that has all changed and professionalized. Every company has a CISO. This is something that CIOs talk about on a daily basis. If you look at budgets inside large enterprise, including many of you sitting in this room, security is the number one line item that sits in the IT budget, and also the one that today probably has the most growth on an annual basis as you try to secure your organization. Identity, for us, is just the most critical step one process to secure, as you think about where many points of breach are and points of entry into an organization. Most of that today is starting internally, and so we think about identity as just being absolutely critical to stopping that that attack vector and attack surface. And of course, that's only going to become a lot more complicated now that We're in a world of accelerated AI development, and that's a whole new frontier that, of course, we're all thinking about on a daily basis and managing, from a company perspective, but also from how do we secure those threat vectors. So I think it's really, this idea that today security is not, something that is, being forced on companies, but it's really just a critical underpin to digital transformation and driving value in a business. And that is just such a massive change from when we started. And it was mainly compliance driven, 15, 20 years ago.
Anything, Andrew, to add to that about kind of the evolution of the identity space? You were digging in the hardest probably 10 years ago, trying to understand all the nuances of the space.
Yeah, I remember when we were digging in back in the day, people didn't like talking about identity. It was a problem that they kind of swept to the back of the organization, and it was really an IT/back office issue. Today, it is a boardroom level topic. It's a CEO level topic. It's something that your employees need to know and understand as well. And so it's just really moved from out of the shadows into the spotlight. I think in a way that's very different from any other cybersecurity industry.
Yeah, it's been fascinating evolution.
Yeah, Andrew, you and Seth both get to talk to a number of cybersecurity leaders, CISOs, CIOs, and interested to hear what are the things that keep them up at night and the pain points that you continually hear from them?
Yeah, so I think one big pain point when you talk to CISOs, and actually it's a pain point of mine as well, there's just so many damn vendors out there. It's hard to keep track of, and there's a new acronym coming out every day. I just got the Gartner report for privilege yesterday, and I remember when privilege, it was just PAM, and now there's 15 different sub-acronyms within privilege, and so keeping up with that, it's like learning a foreign language. But it's that vendor sprawl is happening, and I think CISOs are becoming more stressed out and a little more cognizant of how many vendors they're keeping underneath their umbrella. So that's a pain point. As far as like things keeping them up at night, it's a lot of the same things today that have been there for a long time now. People are still really worried about email. We were, fortunate enough to be able to invest in a company called Proofpoint, which is a leading email security company. So people are worried about email. They're worried about Slack and Teams. They're worried about Zoom. And so just like ways that employees are communicating with each other, it seems to be a huge attack surface. Another pain point for them is just the talent in their organization. Security professionals are so hard to find these days, and they're very expensive. And so when we look at and buying new cybersecurity companies, today the fastest growing piece of almost any cybersecurity business is going to be its managed services business. So taking a lot of the legwork and a lot of the observation and monitoring out of your hands into the ISV's hands. That used to be a business that not a lot of ISVs wanted to get into. And I think CrowdStrike was really the first one that showed like it can be a great business and add a lot of value for your customers. And that's getting adopted across the broader cybersecurity ecosystem today.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think one thing we hear quite a bit, and this isn't only related to security, but it's just buying enterprise applications in general, is making sure that, companies in our portfolio are also then working to make, their customers very successful with the product, right? So this idea that as the world has, really moved from an on-premise world where it was a license maintenance model to one that's now a SaaS world, with very complex integrations across the organization, that enabling that product, which is so mission critical to be successful at the customer and partnership, is critical. And so the way we think about that, and obviously we talk about it a lot at SailPoint, is that customer success and that function in our portfolio companies and at SailPoint is such a critical piece of the business today. And that's a big change over the last 15, 20 years, because that sort of partnership with the customer when you were selling a license once and then renewing maintenance every year is important. But today when you're selling a service and constantly innovating on it and pushing new features all the time, it's important for this partnership between a vendor and a customer to be incredibly tight and all about making the customer successful. So one of the things we hear a lot about is a lack of that. And so we're very focused on it at Thoma Bravo organizationally, and we're focused on it at SailPoint to make sure that customer success function is very, very focused on making sure that after these big investments that all of you are making in products, that you're then ultimately successful using it and showing ROI to your organizations. Because obviously we're living in a world today where budgets are tight, people are looking at all their discretionary spending, and people are only going to work with the vendors and the applications that are providing the most value and making them successful internally.
Yeah, look, I think it's great for the audience to hear that. We spend a huge amount of time. You guys push on it. We push on it. A big part, I think, to the longevity of SailPoint is from day one. This has been a customer-centric, customer-first organization, and I think it shows up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think when we think about kind of the shift to SaaS, we've talked a lot about having started as a software-focused firm that shifted to a SaaS leading but still supporting both models. In either case, but particularly in SaaS, right? That idea of ongoing iterative improvement and ongoing deliver of value, I think it's just a different kind of a mindset, and we've really embraced that. Meredith and her team, I know a lot of you know the CSMs on your accounts well. I mean, their mission is to make you successful. and the good news is we don't have an investor who's asking us to cut costs, so we don't have to do that. They're saying, make sure you're investing in that, because we see it as the long-term success of the business. It's a very refreshing approach, I think, from an investor. I was just talking earlier in my keynote, which was so long ago now, three or four things ago, I remember, and this idea about the confusion in the market, right? I think, Matt, you were mentioning the other day that Gartner put out a new report on this IGA Lite concept, and there were 70, I think 70. You said 70 vendors. Speaking of the vendor explosion that Andrew just mentioned, when you all see, again, Andrew, as you said, the explosion of vendors, there's a good news here, right? Lots of innovation, new things coming, but when you see kind of this noise in the market and people purporting, oh, I've got a converged solution or a simpler solution or things, how do you think the market's going to react to that, and what would you tell folks about what you're seeing evolve there in that industry?
Well, from an investment standpoint, I think if someone came to us and said, like, hey, we have this new endpoint security product, it's called Endpoint Lite, I'd be like, whoa, no, good luck selling that to a CISO. Imagine walking into a CISO's office, hey, we have Endpoint Lite for you, or we have Firewall Lite. And so, woo, you're digging your own grave. And so it's funny, we hear a lot about IGA Lite, and I'm just like, wow. This is a really hard problem. And yes, we understand this is a complex software solution, but it's complex because it has to be. Right. There's no easy way to do it, unfortunately. And we think at SailPoint, you have found the easiest and best way to do it, but it's still a very complex solution. So I think the other thing is, from a converged platform perspective, I think some other areas of identity are probably easier to build, easier, maybe more commoditized, things like single sign-on. But if you're getting, identity governance, you want it from a company that lives and breathes identity governance. It's the hardest thing to do in all of identity. And so trying to start outside of governance and then build governance into your platform over time, it doesn't seem like a winning strategy. And we were laughing about this last night at dinner, but you're one of the godfathers of IGA.
Thank you for saying that, Andrew.
And that's what drew us to SailPoint the first time, was we realized how complex of an issue this was, and we knew that we had people that were, solving this problem and designing the roadmap of the company and building the solutions that knew this space better than anyone in the world. And so I think it's still, it needs to be your core competency.
Seth, any other thoughts on kind of how you see that part of the noise around the explosion of interest in the identity space and just lots of vendors showing up? And
well, first of all, it makes sense.
Yep,
right.
It does.
It's a massive problem to solve, and back to why are we here for round two? It's because you've all innovated in that market and continue to innovate, and are solving very, very complex issues at the largest companies in the world. That's not easy to do. No. And you have to get this identity piece of your business right as you're securing your organization, whether it's internal or external. And obviously, we are invested really across both, and we just see tremendous growth probably more growth in this subsector of security just in general than we see anywhere else, which is why we've put so much capital behind it and really backed the innovators and best companies in we think all corners of the market. So it just, I think, goes back to the cost of breach, the fact that in many cases it starts with identity, when there is a breach. And so that identity value chain for customers, employees, partners, everybody in and around the ecosystem is just more important today than it's ever been. And it's harder to solve because you're doing it at a much bigger scale. And then you fold into there, elements like generative AI, where it's now much easier to spoof, an ID or, either whether it's audio or, something physically. And that, that's just a massive problem that we all need to worry about and think about. So I think this whole area is still early, and I think there's just so much innovation that we're going to continue to see. But, for us, we tend to not worry about, there are a lot of vendors, people always chase big markets like this, but, I think, obviously with companies like SailPoint, you've just proven over a long period of time to be ahead of the market and innovating ahead of the market and looking at where it's going, which, for us as investors is really critical, and I would imagine for your customers as well.
All right, last question. You guys have had such a good run for a long period of time, such a successful business. And in my short time with you, you're always a couple steps ahead, right? You're ahead of the market, ahead of where things are going. So maybe you can share a little bit about, what do you see coming, right? Are there some big trends unfolding in cyber and identity?
We've talked about it a little bit. I do think the one that definitely is coming up at every single one of our board meetings at every company in cyber and obviously the identity companies is this concern around AI and how to manage it. And it's early, but it's moving probably faster than I think any technological innovation that's being used, at least in my career. The pace that it's gaining acceptance and scale is not something that I think that we've all had to deal with before. So it's really addressing that, from a security perspective. Obviously, every company also needs to address it from a policy perspective. I think as we think about it, it's really a twofold opportunity. One is there is a ton of kind of productivity gains that every company can get from properly incorporating it into workflows. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that. But then, of course, on the breach side, it's a whole new threat vector that, we are working with our companies to get ahead of and build in features. And I think it's going to be a battle for a while, right? I think this is something that is just here now that we're going to have to constantly think about and monitor and innovate towards. So I think that's the single biggest thing, at least from our perspective, that's real time, and something that is taking up a lot of our time and attention today.
Yeah, I think if you look across our portfolio, the one glaring hole that we have, the one area we're not really exposed to is cloud security. And that's just because of our business model. We invest in large, more mature cybersecurity businesses. And there's really only one large cloud security vendor out there right now that's independent, which is Wiz, and they're on an IPO path, they're unbuyable. And so I think a trend that you'll see from us over the next couple of years is we'll start to make bets in that cloud security space, in the cloud security posture management space specifically, once those vendors that are playing in that space start to get a little bit bigger. So yeah.
Well, appreciate it. Probably have a couple minutes. I can throw you the question we threw in the exec circle yesterday. You guys are watching financial markets at all times, and there's about 1,000 people in here with probably 2,000 opinions on the future of the economy. So, from where you guys sit, kind of what do you see unfolding maybe the rest of this year, next year? Are we kind of through the worst of it? Still got some tough road ahead? How do you see? And that obviously colors how you think about your investments, right?
Whatever we say will not be right. That's the only thing that I know. It is just impossible to predict, what is going to happen. I think there's right now so much going on in the world, obviously. We're sitting in an interest rate environment that we've not been in for decades at this point. And, I think we're sort of getting used to it, but, I think there's still a lot left to play out. We see, generally it feels like business demand is very good and stable at least, and it's become predictable. About a year ago, 15 months ago, it was hard to predict. I think everybody was trying to figure out where their budgets were coming from, how much budget they had left to spend, that fiscal year. That piece of it feels like it's normalized. But I still think we're sitting, in a world with lots of uncertainty, really high interest rates, inflation still pretty high. And I really, I think we're kind of adapting to this current environment, which maybe everybody expected to change and kind of go back to the way things were in free money pretty quickly. But that, that's likely not going to happen. But it's very hard. It's very, very hard to predict, what's going to happen. I think there's just been so many surprises. So we try to stay out of the prediction business, but it does feel like the world, things feel more predictable than they did this time last year. And I think as it relates to, just general business, that's a very good thing.
Anything to add?
Well, just given we're in a room full of customers and prospects, I would say go back to your CFOs and tell them you heard two financial experts say that everything is going to be better and the economy is going to go up and to the right, and open up the checkbook in Q4.
Yeah. However, we don't want you talking to our teenage children. Stay away from them. No, I really appreciate you guys. I was going to throw one last one. You want to predict the next U.S. president? No, I'm kidding. That's a total joke. No, we really appreciate you guys coming out, joining us. Andrew's on the East Coast, Seth's on the West, so they flew in to be here with us. And your perspective on the industry is just very broad and very deep. And I think it's just great to kind of hear some of the things you see emerging. And we appreciate this ongoing support. And thanks for coming with us.
Thanks,
Thank
Mark.
you. Yeah.
I saw. Can we take a selfie?
Can we take a selfie?
Can we take a selfie? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I have a millennial who I love to death. I guess we have to do a selfie on stage. Okay, we're gonna do this because that's what we do. Because Matt and I always do selfies. Oh, this way.
You gotta get the crowd.
Wait. There you go.
Way.
Okay, there it is. Say hey, team.
SailPoint on 3. 1, 2, 3. SailPoint. Woo!